the chronological history of Greek mythology. Before the Pantheon on Mount Olympus, before the heroes and monsters, before the tales of war and quests that have defined Western culture, there was nothing and everything. Imagine a state not of darkness, for darkness requires a space to exist in. Imagine a state not of silence, for silence is the absence of sound. Imagine a time before time itself had been conceived. This is where our story begins. Not with a command, not with a creator, but with a yawning, formless, and infinite abyss. The Greeks had a word for it: chaos. This is the story of creation. Not a gentle, ordered creation, but a violent, passionate, and terrifying birth of a universe, where gods were not benevolent shepherds, but raw, elemental forces, and where the first act of cosmic order was an act of brutal rebellion. This is the Theogony, the birth of the gods. Chaos in the ancient tongue. The word doesn't mean disorder as we use it today. It is the primordial chasm, the great yawning gap. It was not empty, nor was it full. It simply was. It had no direction, no dimension, no beginning, and no end. Within this unstate, this womb of potential, the first stirrings of existence occurred, not by thought or design, but through a process of cosmic self-generation. From the unfathomable depths of chaos, the first fundamental realities emerged. They were not gods in the way we think of Zeus or Apollo, with human forms and fickle personalities. They were the very concepts that would allow a universe to exist. First, rising like a great, stable foundation from the formlessness, came Gamma, Alpha, Alpha Gaia, the Earth. She was not merely a planet. She was the primal mother, the deep-breasted one, the eternal, unshakable seat of all that would ever live. Gaia represented substance, reality, and the very ground beneath the feet of future generations. With her existence, there was now a here. Then, as if to provide a cosmic opposite, a deep and terrifying foundation below, emerged Tartarus. This was not yet the prison it would become, but a vast, misty abyss as far below the earth as the sky would be above it. If Gaia was existence, Tartarus was the grim, cavernous depth, a place of shadow and consequence. And between them, a force, the most crucial principle of all. Rho Omega Sigma Eros. This was not the cherubic Cupid, with his bow and arrow. This was Eros the primordial, the fundamental force of love, desire, and procreation. Eros was the engine of the universe, the irresistible power that would compel the other primordials to mingle, to create, to fill the void. Without Eros, existence would have remained static and lonely. He was the spark that would ignite the cosmos. And finally, from chaos emerged two shadows, born of the void itself. Rho Epsilon Beta Omicron Sigma, the impenetrable darkness that would fill the corners of the world, and his sister, the formidable goddess of night. Nyx was a figure of immense power and mystery, a being so ancient and dreadful that even Zeus himself would later fear to anger her. Together, Erebus and Nyx would couple, and from their union would be born beings of light, Ether, the bright, pure upper air, breathed by the gods, and Hemera, the day. In this first act of procreation, we see a fundamental theme of Greek myth. From darkness, light is born. So the stage is set. We have Earth, a deep abyss, the force of desire, and the dance of night and day, But the stage is empty. Gaia, the great Mother Earth, lay vast and solitary, with no sky to gaze upon. And so, in a feat of parthenogenesis of virgin birth, Gaia brought forth her own equal, a being to cover her completely. She gave birth to Uranus, the sky. He was born of her, and yet he was her perfect counterpart. Star-spangled, vast, and majestic, he arched over her, embracing her on all sides. Gaia had created her own husband, her own lover, her own eternal companion. Their union was absolute. The sky lay upon the earth constantly, without separation. Together, they were the cosmos. From her, too, came the Aurea, the long winding hills and mountains that gave her features, and Pontus, the barren swelling depths of the sea. But it was her union with Uranus that would truly populate the universe with its first dynasty of gods. This was not a gentle, romantic love, but a relentless, suffocating, and terrifyingly fertile embrace. From this unending coupling, the first generation of true deities was born. First came the 12 Titans. These were gods of immense power, personifications of the great, raw concepts of the world. There were 6 brothers and 6 sisters, the Titanides. They were Oceanus, the great river that encircled the world; Cus, the Titan of intellect; Crius and Hyperion, the Titan of heavenly light, who would father the sun, the moon, and the dawn. There was Iapetus, whose sons Prometheus and Atlas would later play pivotal roles in the fate of gods and men. And finally, the youngest, the most clever, and the most dangerously ambitious of them all, Cronus, the crooked counseling Cronus, whose destiny was intertwined with the very fabric of time and power. Their sisters were no less formidable. There was Rhea, who would become the mother of the Olympians; Themis, the embodiment of divine law and order; Mnemosyne, the personification of memory, from whom the Muses would be born. There was Phoebe, the shining titaness of prophecy; Tethys, the mother of thousands of river and sea spirits; and Thea, the goddess of sight and shimmering light. These 12 Titans were glorious, perfect in form, a dynasty of rulers in waiting. But the union of earth and sky did not stop there. Their next children were different. They were monstrous. Gaia gave birth to the 3 Cyclopes, Brontes, Sterops, and Arges. They were giants, possessing immense strength and skill. But their defining feature was a single blazing eye set in the middle of their foreheads. They were not mere brutes. They were master craftsmen, beings who understood the secrets of fire and metal, who could forge weapons of unimaginable power. Then came the 3rd brood, the most terrifying of all, the Hecaton Shires, the 100-handed ones. There were 3 of them, Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges. Each had 50 heads, capable of speaking with 50 different terrible voices, and from their hulking shoulders sprouted 100 immensely powerful arms. They were beings of pure, untamed, chaotic strength, a walking engine of destruction. Uranus, the majestic sky, looked upon these later children with horror and disgust. The perfect humanoid forms of the Titans were one thing, but these single-eyed smiths and 100-armed abominations, they were a perversion. They were a threat. Their raw power, their monstrous forms, he saw in them a challenge to his supremacy. He was the ruler of the cosmos, and he would not tolerate such beings. And so, Uranus committed his first great crime, a crime not just against his children, but against his wife, Gaia herself. As each of the Cyclopes and Hecaton Shires were born, he took them, and with his immense strength, he thrust them back into the womb from which they came. He imprisoned them deep within the body of Gaia, deep within the hollows of the earth. Imagine the agony of Gaia. She was the earth, the universal mother, and her own husband was using her body as a prison for her children. She groaned under the strain, her vast form aching with the unnatural burden. The children trapped inside her raged, causing earthquakes and internal torment. This was not a union of love anymore. It was an act of tyrannical oppression. Ouranos' constant embrace had become a suffocating prison. Gaia's love for Uranus curdled into a deep, burning hatred. She was determined to have her revenge, not just for herself, but for her imprisoned children. She needed an instrument of vengeance. Deep within her own substance, she found a seam of a strange, gray, and unbreakable metal. From it, she fashioned a tool, a massive saw-toothed sickle, adamantine and terrible, a weapon capable of wounding a god. With the weapon forged, she gathered her other children, the Titans, and spoke to them of their father's wickedness and her plan for liberation. "My children," her voice echoed through the deep places of the world, "born of a wicked father. If you will obey me, we shall avenge the brutal outrage of your father. For he was the first to devise shameful acts. Silence." The mighty Titans were gripped by fear. To rebel against Uranus? Their father, the sky itself, whose power was absolute. None dared to speak. Their ambition was not yet greater than their terror. None, that is, except one, the youngest, Cronus, he who harbored a special resentment for his arrogant father. He stepped forward, his mind already churning with schemes and ambition. "Mother," he declared, his voice steady, "I will undertake this deed. I do not dread our accursed father, for as you say, he was the first to devise shameful acts." Gaia's heart swelled with grim satisfaction. She had found her champion, her instrument of vengeance. She gave the great adamantine sickle to Cronus and laid out her plan. She placed him in ambush, in a secret place where Uranus would not see him, and waited. That evening, as Nyx night drew her dark veil across the cosmos, Uranus descended once more. Longing for Gaia, he came to lie with her, spreading his vast, starry self over the earth, unaware of the treachery that awaited him. As the sky god embraced the earth, Cronus sprang from his hiding place. With his left hand, he grabbed his father, and with his right, he swung the great, jagged sickle. In one horrific, brutal motion, he severed his father's genitals, castrating the sky itself. A scream of pure agony and shock echoed through the nascent universe, a sound that had never been heard before. Cronus threw the severed members over his shoulder, behind him. The act was done. For the first time, there was a permanent separation between the sky and the earth. Uranus retreated, wounded and undone, creating the space for a new world to exist between them. But such a primal act of violence could not happen without consequence. This was a wound upon the very fabric of reality. As the blood of the castrated sky god fell, it spattered upon the fertile ground of Mother Earth. And from these crimson drops, new and terrible beings were born. First, from the blood that soaked the earth, arose the Erinyes, known to the Romans as the Furies. They were terrifying goddesses of vengeance, with snakes for hair and bats' wings, whose purpose was to hunt down and punish those who committed crimes against their own kin, especially patricide and matricide. In the very act of Cronus's rebellion, the force that would one day punish such acts was born. From the blood also sprang the Gigantes, the giants. Not to be confused with the Titans, these were towering, warlike beings, born of violence, who would one day rise to challenge the gods in a desperate war for control of the cosmos. And finally, the Malaya, the nymphs of the ash trees, the very wood from which spears would one day be made. Thus, from this single act of bloodshed, the concepts of vengeance, war, and the weapons of war were seeded into the world. But the story of the castration does not end there. Cronus had thrown his father's severed parts into the sea. For a long time, they drifted on the waves of the ocean. A white, divine foam began to churn and bubble around the immortal flesh. From this sea foam, a miracle occurred. Slowly, gracefully, a figure began to take shape, rising from the waters on a giant scallop shell, a goddess of such breathtaking beauty and perfection that the world had never seen her like. Her skin was the color of milk, her hair a cascade of gold. Where she stepped ashore on the island of Cyprus, flowers bloomed in her footsteps. This was Aphrodite, the foam-born, the goddess of love, beauty, pleasure, and passion. She was of an older generation than the Olympians, born not from a mother's womb, but from the violent mutilation of the sky god. Her very existence is a paradox that lies at the heart of Greek thought, that from the most brutal and violent act imaginable, the most sublime and transcendent beauty can arise. Love and violence, inextricably linked from the very beginning. And so, the first epoch of the universe came to a close. Uranus was overthrown, his power broken. His final act was to utter a curse upon his treacherous son, prophesying that Cronus, too, would be undone by his own child, a prophecy that would haunt the new king and shape the next age of the world. A new king now sat on the throne of the cosmos, Cronus, the Titan of time. With his sister Rhea as his queen, he freed his Titan siblings, and together they ruled over a so-called Golden Age. The world was new, and the Titans were its masters. But a dark question lingered in the newly formed space between earth and sky. The Cyclopes and the Hundred-Handed Ones, the monstrous brothers whose imprisonment had started this bloody revolution, remained locked away in the pit of Tartarus. Cronus, having used their plight to fuel his rebellion, now feared their power as much as his father had. He was a king born from patricide, haunted by a curse, and already beginning to display the same tyrannical paranoia that had defined his father. The first act of creation was over. A new order was established, but it was an order built on a foundation of violence, betrayal, and a lingering curse. The age of the Titans had begun, but the seeds of its own destruction were already sown, waiting for the birth of a new generation of gods who would once again challenge the king of the universe for his throne. The cycle of rebellion had only just begun. The first great war of the heavens was over. The tyrannical sky, Uranus, was vanquished, his power broken by the sickle of his own son. A new dynasty now ruled the cosmos. The Titans, led by the shrewd and ambitious Cronus, had seized control, and under their reign, the world entered a period of seeming perfection, an era that would be sung of for centuries to come as the Golden Age. It was a time when the mortal race, a still new creation upon the earth, lived like gods. They knew no toil, no sorrow, no miserable old age. The fertile earth, Gaia, provided all they needed without the need for plow or sow. They lived in peace and harmony, and when their time was done, they passed away as if falling into a gentle sleep. It was an idyll, a paradise. But this peace was a fragile illusion. For while mortals enjoyed their perfect existence on earth, in the gleaming halls of the heavens, the heart of the new king was anything but golden. It was a heart filled with paranoia, guilt, and annoying, all-consuming fear. Cronus, the new lord of the universe, was a king born of rebellion and bloodshed. He was the son who had raised a weapon against his own father. The Furies, the Erinyes, those terrifying goddesses of vengeance born from his father's blood, may not have pursued him, for his act was sanctioned by his mother, Gaia. But their essence, the very concept of familial betrayal, now stained the cosmic throne. Cronus ruled with the knowledge that power obtained by violence could be lost by violence. His first act as king was a telling one. He had come to power on the promise of liberation, to avenge the imprisonment of his monstrous siblings, the Cyclopes and the Hundred-Handed Ones. Yet, once his Titan brothers and sisters were freed, and the crown was his, the gates of Tartarus remained firmly shut. He looked upon the Cyclopes' single burning eye and the Hecaton Shire's 100 flailing arms, and he felt the same revulsion, the same fear that his father had. He saw not siblings, but rivals. He saw chaos and power that could not be easily controlled, and so he left them to languish in the dark, a decision that revealed the core of his new regime. It was not about justice, but about power. Cronus was the god of the harvest, but his name, Cronus, became inextricably linked with another, similar Greek word, chronos, time. And it is a bitter irony that the god who personified time would become its greatest victim. He ruled over the passage of moments, seasons, and ages, yet he was terrified of what the future would bring. Every tick of the cosmic clock was, to him, a step closer to his own prophesied doom. For the dying curse of his father, Uranus, echoed in his mind, and this fear was given voice and substance by his own mother, Gaia, the earth, who sees all things that were, and are to come. She, who had once sponsored his rebellion, now delivered the chilling prophecy that sealed his fate. "Be warned, my son," the voice of the earth whispered to him, "you who were so bold as to usurp your own father. A great and terrible fate is bound to you. For as you have overthrown him, so too are you destined to be overthrown by a child born of your own flesh." The prophecy struck Cronus like a thunderbolt. It confirmed his deepest fears. His children, his own offspring, would be the instruments of his destruction. The cycle of patricide, the very crime he had pioneered, would turn upon him. His mind, already crooked with ambition, now became warped by a terrible, consuming paranoia. He looked at his beautiful wife, Rhea, the titaness of motherhood and fertility, and saw not a partner, but a vessel for his own demise. Their union, which should have been a joyous continuation of the divine line, became a source of dread. Soon Rhea was with child. She gave birth to a daughter, a goddess of stunning purity. Her name was Hestia, the future goddess of the hearth, home, and sacred fire. As Rhea held her firstborn, her heart filled with a mother's love. But Cronus saw no daughter. He saw only the prophecy. He saw a threat. With a resolve born of pure terror, he strode forward, took the newborn goddess from his wife's arms, and before Rhea could even scream, he opened his cavernous mouth and swallowed the baby whole. He imprisoned her not in the earth, as his father had done, but within his own divine body, a living tomb from which there could be no escape. Rhea's shriek of agony was lost in the vast halls of the heavens. Her first child was gone, consumed by its own father. Her grief was absolute, but she was powerless before the paranoid might of the king of the universe. This horrifying act set a grim precedent. It became a dark, recurring ritual at the heart of the Golden Age. Time and again, Rhea would bear a child, a beautiful and powerful new god, and time and again, her hope would be shattered. Next, she bore Demeter, the future goddess of the harvest and agriculture, a being whose very essence was to give life to the world. And Cronus, the lord of the harvest, devoured her too, consuming the very concept of earthly bounty in his desperate bid to stop time. Then came Hera, a goddess of majestic bearing, destined to be the queen of the heavens, the goddess of marriage and family. Her father swallowed her, perverting the very idea of family she represented. The first of his sons was born next. Hades, a grim and solemn god, fated to be the ruler of the dead and the underworld. In a flash of terrifying irony, the future lord of the dead was himself consumed, sent into the living darkness of his father's gut. Then came Poseidon, a god with the wild and untamed power of the sea in his spirit, the future shaker of the earth and ruler of the oceans. Cronus seized him and swallowed him, attempting to contain the uncontrollable power of the sea within his own form. 5 children. 5 times Rhea had suffered this unbearable loss. Her heart was shattered. She was the great mother, yet she was forced to watch her children become fodder for her husband's fear. The court of the Titans was a place of silent terror, ruled by a king who was, in effect, pregnant with his own children and his own doom. He grew stronger, absorbing their divine power, but his fear only deepened. He had tried to stop the future by swallowing it, but in doing so, he had only made the eventual explosion of that future all the more potent. As Rhea became pregnant with her 6th child, she knew she could not endure the ritual again. Her grief finally hardened into a steely resolve. She would not allow this child to suffer the same fate. She would defy the king of the gods, but she could not do it alone. In her desperation, she turned to the only beings powerful enough to understand her plight, her own parents, Gaia and Uranus. She descended to the earth and prayed to her mother, the ancient soil, and to her mutilated father, the distant, brooding sky. "Mother, father," she cried, "help me. Help your daughter. Help me devise a plan so that I may hide the birth of my child, and so that my cruel husband may finally pay the price for his crimes against his father and for the monstrous crime of devouring his own children." Gaia and Uranus heard her plea. Gaia, the great mother, felt the pain of her daughter as she had once felt her own. She who had plotted against Uranus now agreed to plot against Cronus. The cosmic wheel was turning. She revealed to Rhea the plan that would save her child and change the destiny of the universe. Following her mother's instructions, Rhea traveled to the island of Crete, to a deep, secluded cave on the slopes of Mount Dicte. There, in secret, as darkness veiled the world, she gave birth to her 3rd son. A boy. She named him Zeus. But a newborn god's cry is not a thing that can be easily hidden. It can echo through the cosmos. So Gaia arranged for protectors. The Curetes, warrior spirits of the earth, stood guard at the cave's entrance. Whenever the infant Zeus would cry, they would begin a frenzied, ritualistic war dance, beating their spears against their bronze shields, their stomping feet and roaring chants, creating a deafening cacophony that drowned out the baby's cries, fooling Cronus into thinking it was nothing but the clamor of a distant storm. The child needed a nurse. Gaia provided Amalthea, a divine goat, whose milk nourished the future king, giving him strength. From one of Amalthea's horns, which was accidentally broken, would come the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, a magical object that could overflow with endless food and drink. The symbolism was potent. From a simple, nurturing act of nature, eternal abundance was born. With her son safely hidden, Rhea now had to face her tyrannical husband. She returned from Crete, her face a mask of sorrow, her arms cradling a bundle of blankets. Cronus, suspecting nothing, immediately demanded the child. Rhea, her heart pounding with terror and defiance, presented the bundle to him. But inside the blankets, there was no baby. There was only a large, smooth stone, a rock she had picked up on her journey. It was later known as the Omphalos Stone. Cronus, so consumed by his fear, so certain of the pattern of his own monstrous actions, did not even think to check. He snatched the bundle from her, and without a moment's hesitation, he swallowed the stone whole. He felt it slide down his gullet and settle heavily in his stomach amongst his other children. A sigh of relief. He was safe. The sixth threat was neutralized. His reign, he believed, was secure forever. He was the king who had defeated fate itself. He was a fool. The Omphalos Stone would one day be regurgitated and placed at the sacred site of Delphi, where it would be revered as the navel of the world, a testament to this great deception. And so, the Golden Age continued on its two tracks. On Earth, a paradise. In the heavens, a tyrant's peace, built on a lie. Cronus, the Lord of Time, sat on his throne, believing he had frozen his own future, that his power was absolute. He had no idea that far away, hidden in a cave, nursed by a goat, and guarded by dancing warriors, his doom was growing stronger every day. The son he had unknowingly spared was not just another god. He was Zeus, the future lord of lightning and thunder, the king of kings. The revolution was not averted. It was merely postponed. The future that Cronus had tried to swallow was now growing up in secret, preparing for the day when it would rise up and tear down the age of the Titans, unleashing the most terrible war the cosmos had ever seen. The clock was ticking for the god of time. In the court of the Titans, the king of the universe, Cronus, sat on his throne, blissfully ignorant. He had devoured his children, swallowed a stone, and believed he had conquered fate itself. He was the master of time, and he had commanded it to stand still. But time, even for a god, cannot be contained. It can only be delayed. And in a hidden cave on a distant island, the future was growing up. Zeus was not raised in the gilded, paranoid halls of the heavens, but in the wild, untamed cradle of the earth. He was nurtured by the divine goat Amalthea, protected by the war cries of the Curetes, and educated by Gaia herself. He learned not the politics of a tyrant's court, but the fundamental laws of nature, strategy, and power. As he reached adulthood, he was a god of formidable strength, shocking intelligence, and a burning, righteous anger for the injustices suffered by his mother and his swallowed siblings. The time for hiding was over. The time for revolution had come. To challenge the king of the cosmos required more than just strength. It required cunning. Zeus could not simply march on the Titan stronghold of Mount Othrys and demand his father abdicate. He needed to dismantle the regime from within. His first step was to find an ally within the Titan court itself. He found one in Metis, the Oceanid, the Titan goddess of wisdom, prudence, and deep thought. Her name meant cunning intelligence, and she was the perfect partner for Zeus's plan. Together, they concocted a scheme. Zeus would present himself at his father's court, not as a long-lost son, but as a new, unknown cupbearer. Metis, meanwhile, prepared a powerful potion, an emetic mixed with nectar, harmless to a divine being, but guaranteed to cause the swallower to disgorge whatever they held inside. A plan was set into motion. Zeus, his divine power veiled, entered his father's service. Cronus, arrogant and unsuspecting, was pleased with the handsome new servant. One evening, during a feast, Zeus, on the instruction of Metis, presented his father with a special drugged nectar. "A special vintage, my lord," Zeus might have said, his voice steady, betraying none of the furious energy coiled within him. "To honor your eternal reign." Cronus, flattered, took the cup and drank deeply. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a deep, guttural wrenching began in the pit of the Titan King's stomach. A divine indigestion of cosmic proportions. His body convulsed in violent spasms. The other Titans looked on in shock and confusion as their king doubled over in agony. And then a regurgitation began. It was a horrific, violent, and miraculous rebirth. First, spat out onto the celestial floor, was the stone. The Omphalos stone, the symbol of Rhea's great deception, clattering to the ground. And then, one by one, his children emerged, not as infants, but as fully grown, majestic and furious gods, freed from their fleshy prison. Out came Poseidon, his eyes wild with the fury of a caged storm, the power of the oceans already swirling around him. Then Hades, grim and pale, his presence radiating the cold silence of the underworld he was destined to rule. Out came the queenly Hera, her bearing already regal and indignant. The gentle Demeter, her sorrow for her long imprisonment, turning to a cold fury. And finally, the serene Hestia, the first consumed and the last to be freed. They stood there, the 5 siblings, blinking in the light of the heavens for the first time, looking at their younger brother, Zeus, who had saved them. And then they turned their collective gaze upon their father, Cronus, who now stared, horrified, at the prophecy he had tried to swallow, now standing embodied and armed before him. The line was drawn. The war had begun. This was the Titanomachy, the war of the Titans. It was not a battle or a siege, but a decade-long conflict that would tear the universe apart. On one side stood Cronus and the elder Titans, fighting from their fortress on Mount Othrys, beings of raw, elemental power who had ruled for an eternity. On the other side stood Zeus and his newly freed siblings, the Olympians, fighting from the towering peak of Mount Olympus. For 10 years, the war raged in a brutal, destructive stalemate. The very fabric of creation groaned under the strain. They hurled mountains at each other like pebbles. The seas boiled where divine energies clashed. The forests of Gaia burned, and the sky itself screamed with the force of their blows. It was a war of equals, strength against strength, and neither side could gain the upper hand. But Zeus's side had an advantage Cronus's did not. Allies of principle. Not all Titans chose to side with the old regime. Themis, the goddess of divine law and order, and her son Prometheus, the Titan of forethought, saw that Cronus's reign was one of brute force and paranoia, while Zeus represented a new, more structured order. They cast their lot with the Olympians, giving Zeus crucial strategic counsel. Forethought and divine law had abandoned the Titans. Still, the war dragged on. It was Gaia, Mother Earth, who once again intervened to break the deadlock. She who had seen it all knew a secret that could tip the scales. She spoke to her grandson, Zeus. "Victory will not be yours," she counseled, "until you free those whom your father left imprisoned. Your uncles, my first monstrous sons, languish in the pit of Tartarus. Free them, and they will forge for you the weapons of victory." Zeus listened. He journeyed to the very depths of the cosmos, to the dark, misty prison of Tartarus. There, he found his uncles, the 3 Cyclopes and the 300-handed ones, bound in chains of divine make. He slew their jailer and broke their bonds. The gratitude of these immense beings was absolute. The Cyclopes, masters of the forge, immediately set to work, their single eyes burning with creative fire. For Zeus, they crafted the ultimate weapon, the K Epsilon Rho Alpha Upsilon Nu, the Thunderbolt. A weapon that was not just lightning, but the very essence of divine power. A bolt that no being, mortal or immortal, could withstand. For Poseidon, they forged the T Rho I Alpha Iota Nu Alpha, the Trident, a 3-pronged spear with which he could command the oceans, shatter the earth, and stir the tempests. And for Hades, they crafted the K Upsilon Nu Iota, the helm of darkness, a cap that would render its wearer completely invisible, allowing him to move unseen through the world, a weapon of terror and stealth. With these new ultimate weapons, the tide of the war began to turn. But it was the release of the Hecaton Shires that brought the final, overwhelming force. The Olympians unleashed their 100-armed uncles upon the Titans. Imagine the scene. 3 giants, each with 50 heads shrieking a terrifying war cry, each with 100 arms, simultaneously picking up and hurling 300 mountain-sized boulders at the enemy ranks. The Titans, who had never faced such concentrated, chaotic fury, broke. Their lines shattered, their morale evaporated. The sight of the Hecaton Shires, combined with the new terrifying power of Zeus, was too much. Zeus, now fully ascended as the god of thunder, unleashed a barrage from the heavens. He hurled thunderbolt after thunderbolt, setting the earth and the forests ablaze, boiling the oceans, and shaking the cosmos to its foundations. The war ended in a final, cataclysmic Olympian victory. Now came the peace and the punishment. Zeus, unlike his father, did not make the same mistakes. He was a revolutionary, but he was also a politician and a king. He knew that to build a lasting order, the old one had to be permanently dismantled. Most of the male titans who had fought against him were bound in unbreakable chains and cast into the deepest, darkest pits of Tartarus. And in a stroke of genius, Zeus appointed their former fellow prisoners, the 100-handed ones, to be their eternal jailers, ensuring they could never again threaten the new order. For the Titan general, Atlas, who was one of the most powerful and defiant, Zeus reserved a special fate. He was not to be imprisoned in darkness. Instead, he was led to the westernmost edge of the world, and there he was forced to take the vast, heavy sky Uranus upon his back and hold it aloft for all eternity. His punishment was to forever bear the weight of the very entity his generation had fought to control, eternally separating earth and sky, and in doing so, maintaining the stability of the new Olympian world. But a king who has just won a war is at his most vulnerable, and Zeus's rule would face 2 more colossal challenges before it was truly secure. First came the Gigantomachy, the war with the giants. Gaia, Mother Earth, was now furious. She had helped Zeus, yes, But now she was horrified to see her Titan children locked away in Tartarus. In her anger, she gave birth to yet another brood of monstrous children, the Gigantes, the giants. They were born of Ouranos' blood, born of violence itself. Hulking, aggressive beings often depicted with snakes for legs, they were the anti-Olympians, bred for one purpose, to overthrow the new gods. They launched a furious assault on Mount Olympus. But there was a prophecy concerning them. The giants could not be killed by gods alone. A mortal hero had to fight alongside the Olympians for them to achieve victory. This was the moment that the fate of the gods and the fate of humanity became forever intertwined. The Olympians called upon Zeus's yet-to-be-born son, the greatest of all mortal heroes, Heracles, to fight with them. With his help, the Olympians slaughtered the giants and secured their home. The age of cooperation between god and hero had begun. Yet, Gaia had one last card to play, one final ultimate monster, her last child, born of her union with Tartarus itself, a being of such unimaginable horror that his existence was a threat to all of creation. His name was Typhon. Typhon was not a god, nor a giant, nor a titan. He was an apocalypse made flesh. He was taller than the highest mountains, and his head brushed the stars. From his shoulders sprouted 100 dragon heads, each speaking with a different, terrifying voice, hissing like snakes, roaring like lions, bellowing like bulls, and even speaking the language of the gods. Fire blazed from his eyes. His lower half was a mass of giant vipers, and his arms, when spread, reached from the east to the west. When the Olympians saw him rise, for the first and only time, they were gripped by pure, unadulterated terror. They fled. They disguised themselves as animals and scattered across Egypt, leaving Zeus alone to face the monster that sought to unmake the world. The battle between Zeus and Typhon was not a war. It was a cataclysm. Zeus unleashed the full, untamed fury of his thunderbolts. The cosmos shook. The earth burned, the sea boiled, and even the underworld shuddered. Typhon fought back, breathing streams of fire, his 100 heads roaring a symphony of destruction. In the initial clash, Typhon managed to defeat Zeus, tearing the sinews from his limbs and leaving him helpless. But Hermes, the messenger god, daringly snuck past the monster and restored Zeus's sinews. Healed and burning with divine rage, Zeus renewed his assault. He chased Typhon across the world, relentlessly bombarding him with thunderbolts until the monster was wounded and reeling. Finally, near Sicily, Zeus lifted the entire island of Mount Etna and hurled it down upon the beast, trapping him beneath the earth. To this day, the ancient Greeks believed that the volcanic eruptions of Mount Etna were the fiery breath of the defeated Typhon, still raging in his subterranean prison. With the defeat of Typhon, all challenges were ended. Zeus had not just won a war against his father. He had defeated the forces of raw chaos, disciplined the earth with the help of a mortal, and single-handedly triumphed over a world-ending monster. His authority was now absolute and undisputed. The Titanomachy was over. The age of chaos and rebellion was at an end. A new era of order had dawned. The Olympian gods, forged in war and led by a king who had proven his might and wisdom, now sat securely on their thrones. Their gaze, once turned inward toward their own struggles for power, could now turn outward to the division of the cosmos and to the small, fledgling race of mortals who lived upon the earth below. The age of the Olympians had truly begun. The wars were over. The universe, which had been born in violence and forged in rebellion, had finally found a lasting peace. The Titans were defeated, the giants slain, and the ultimate monster, Typhon, lay groaning beneath a mountain. On the peak of Olympus, a new power resided, not a singular paranoid tyrant like Cronus, but a council, a family of gods, led by a king who had proven his right to rule. Zeus's first act as undisputed sovereign was not one of conquest, but of order. He understood what his father and grandfather had not. That power shared is power solidified. He gathered his two elder brothers, who had fought beside him and been instrumental in his victory, to formally divide the spoils of creation. They would not fight over the world. They would cast lots for it, letting fate itself affirm their domains. It was a foundational moment, a divine constitutional convention. 3 lots were cast into a golden helmet, one for the heavens, one for the sea, and one for the misty darkness of the underworld. Zeus, as was his right as leader, drew first. His lot was the vast, open expanse of the sky. He would be king of the gods and men, the ultimate arbiter of justice, the cloud gatherer, the wielder of the thunderbolt. From his throne on Olympus, he would oversee all, his domain representing law, order, and the bright, majestic authority of the heavens. Next came Poseidon. He drew the lot for the sea. His domain would be the wild, unpredictable, and deep blue waters that cover most of the world. He would be the earth-shaker, the god of tempests, earthquakes, and horses. His realm was one of untamed power, a source of both immense bounty and terrifying destruction, a reflection of his own tempestuous and moody character. Finally, the eldest brother, Hades, drew the third and final lot. His was the underworld, the vast subterranean realm of darkness, where the souls of the dead reside. He would be the king of the dead, the ruler of a kingdom every mortal would one day enter, but from which none could return. His domain was not one of evil, but of finality, wealth, and grim, unyielding inevitability. He was not the god of death itself. That was Thanatos, but the host to all who had died, a somber and powerful king in his own right. The earth itself, Gaia, was left common to them all, a stage upon which their powers could interact, and a home for the creatures that were yet to come. With the world thus divided, the time came to establish the full Pantheon that would rule over it. These were the 12 Olympians, a family as brilliant as they were dysfunctional, whose passions, rivalries, and ambitions would shape the destiny of the mortal world. At the head of this family sat Zeus, the king. Beside him sat his sister and wife, Hera. As the queen of the gods, she was the formidable goddess of marriage, women, and childbirth. Proud, regal, and fiercely protective of the sanctity of her marriage, her story would be one of perpetual indignation, as she was forced to endure Zeus's countless infidelities, often taking out her rage not on her husband, but on his lovers and his illegitimate children. Her symbol was the peacock, its thousand-eyed tail a reminder of her vigilance. The 2 brothers, Poseidon and Hades, ruled their own realms, but held seats on the council. With them were their sisters. Demeter, the gentle goddess of the harvest, agriculture, and the life-giving fertility of the earth. Her moods were reflected in the seasons, her joy bringing bounty, her sorrow bringing famine. And Hestia, the virgin goddess of the hearth and home, the calm center of the Olympian family. She was the most peaceful and domestic of the gods, representing the sacred fire that burned at the heart of every Greek home. She was so revered that she eventually gave up her seat on the council to avoid conflict, some say to the god Dionysus. Then came Zeus's children, a generation born into power. First and foremost, from his head sprang Athena, born fully grown and clad in armor after Zeus swallowed her mother Metis. Athena was the goddess of wisdom, strategic warfare, and civilization. She was the protector of cities, especially Athens, which was named for her. A fierce virgin goddess, her wisdom was her weapon, a stark contrast to her half-brother's love of bloodshed. Her symbols were the owl and the olive tree. Her brother was Ares, the god of war. Son of Zeus and Hera, he represented the brutal, chaotic, and bloodthirsty aspect of battle. While Athena was strategy, Ares was pure rage and violence. He was impulsive, aggressive, and unpopular with many of the other gods, but revered by warriors. Also among Zeus's children were the divine twins, born to the Titaness Leto on the floating island of Delos. Apollo, a god of music, poetry, prophecy, medicine, and the sun. He was the epitome of youthful, civilized beauty and order, the leader of the Muses, and the master of the prophetic oracle at Delphi. His twin sister Artemis was the virgin goddess of the hunt, the wilderness, wild animals, and the moon. Fiercely independent and protective of her nymphs, she roamed the wild places of the earth, a skilled archer and a formidable, untamed goddess. From the sea foam, of course, came the elder goddess Aphrodite, the goddess of love, beauty, and desire. Her power was of a different kind, a captivating, often disruptive force that could overwhelm the will of both gods and mortals. She was married to the most unlikely of husbands, Hephaestus. Hephaestus was the son of Hera, born lame and cast from Olympus by his disgusted mother. He was the god of the forge, fire, and craftsmanship. A master blacksmith, he created the god's most wondrous artifacts, including Zeus's thunderbolts, in his volcanic workshop. Though physically imperfect, his creative genius was unparalleled. And finally, there was Hermes, son of Zeus and the nymph Maia. He was the messenger of the gods, the god of travelers, merchants, thieves, and tricksters. With his winged sandals and helmet, he moved between the worlds of gods and mortals with unmatched speed and wit. He was the clever, fast-talking diplomat and conductor of souls to the underworld, the most sociable and cunning of the gods. This was the family, a council of power, brilliance, and deeply flawed personalities. With their order established, they looked upon the earth and saw that it was empty of worshippers. It was time to create a race of beings in their own image, beings who could build temples, offer sacrifices, and reflect the glory of the gods. The task fell to a Titan who had sided with them in the war, Prometheus, the Titan of forethought. Prometheus went down to the earth. He took clay, mixed it with river water, and with the skill of a divine sculptor, he molded the mixture into figures resembling the gods themselves. He crafted them with care, giving them 2 legs to stand upright, so they could gaze towards the heavens, unlike the other animals who looked down at the ground. But they were just lifeless clay dolls. They needed a soul, a spark of life. It was the goddess Athena, patron of creation, who breathed spirit and life into his clay figures. And thus mankind was born. In this early age, men lived in idyllic simplicity, much like the Golden Age under Cronus. They lived amongst the gods, sharing meals and conversation. But this cozy relationship was not to last. It was shattered by Prometheus's fierce, almost paternal love for his creation and an act of legendary trickery. At a great feast held at Nacon, where gods and men were to determine how animal sacrifices would be divided, Prometheus decided to champion humanity's cause. He butchered a great ox and divided it into 2 portions. In one pile, he placed all the finest cuts of meat, but hid them beneath the unappetizing sight of the ox's stomach. In the other pile, he skillfully arranged all the bones, but covered them with a glistening, enticing layer of white fat. He then presented the 2 piles to Zeus and asked him to choose which portion the gods would claim for themselves for all future sacrifices. Zeus, seeing the tempting pile of fat, chose it. When he uncovered the offering and found nothing but bones, his fury was immense. He had been tricked. By this single act of cunning, Prometheus had forever decreed that men would keep the meat from their sacrifices and burn only the bones and fat for the gods. Zeus's punishment was swift and targeted humanity. Let them eat their raw meat. He thundered, and in his anger, he took fire away from the earth, plunging mankind into a dark, cold, and primitive existence. Seeing his beloved creation shivering in caves, unable to cook food, forge tools, or see in the night, Prometheus's heart broke. His forethought told him the consequences would be dire, but his love for humanity was greater than his fear of Zeus. He took a long, hollow stalk of a giant fennel plant, and he flew up to the heavens. As the sun chariot of Apollo passed, he thrust the stalk into its fiery wheel, catching a glowing ember inside. He then brought this ember back down to earth, a secret seed of fire, and gave it to mankind. Fire transformed human existence. It brought warmth, light, safety from predators, cooked food, and the ability to forge metal. It was the spark of civilization itself, but it was also an act of direct defiance against the king of the gods. Zeus's rage was now boundless, and his vengeance would be twofold and terrible. One punishment for the thief, and one for those who had received the stolen goods. First, Prometheus. Zeus ordered Hephaestus to forge chains of unbreakable adamantine. Hermes dragged the defiant Titan to the Caucasus Mountains, at the very edge of the world. There, he was chained to a great rock, exposed to the blistering sun and freezing winds. And every single day, Zeus sent a giant eagle to tear open Prometheus's abdomen and devour his liver. And every single night, because he was immortal, his liver would grow back, ready for the eagle's return at dawn. It was a sentence of eternal, conscious, unrelenting agony. Next, Zeus devised a punishment for mankind, a more subtle, and in many ways, more insidious revenge. He ordered Hephaestus to create a new being, molding clay and water into the form of a beautiful maiden. Athena dressed her in shimmering garments. Aphrodite bestowed upon her irresistible grace and beauty, and Hermes filled her mind with cunning, curiosity, and a deceitful nature. She was the first woman. Her name was Pandora, meaning all gifted, for each of the gods had given her a gift to make her the ultimate temptation. Zeus presented this beautiful evil as a bride to Prometheus's slow-witted brother, Epimetheus the Titan of afterthought. Prometheus had warned his brother never to accept the gift from Zeus, but Epimetheus, dazzled by Pandora's beauty, forgot the warning and welcomed her. As a wedding gift, Zeus gave Pandora a large sealed jar, a pithos, with one simple instruction. She was never, ever to open it. But Zeus, through Hermes, had gifted her with a powerful curiosity. The mystery of the jar gnawed at her. What could be inside? Why was it forbidden? Finally, she could resist no longer. She lifted the heavy lid. Instantly, a dark, swarming cloud of terrible things burst forth and scattered across the globe. These were all the evils that had been sealed away: disease, suffering, spite, old age, toil, misery, war, and every other plague to torment humanity. The idyllic, easy life of man was over forever, replaced by a life of hardship and pain. Horrified, Pandora slammed the lid shut, but it was too late. Everything had escaped. Everything, that is, except for one last thing that fluttered weakly at the very bottom of the jar. Elpis, hope. And so, humanity was left in a world full of misery and suffering, with only hope to cling to. Whether hope was a final gift to make life bearable, or the final cruelty to prolong the suffering, the Greeks would debate for centuries. In the ages that followed, humanity, now beset by evil, grew corrupt and wicked. They were filled with violence and showed no respect for the gods. Looking down from Olympus, Zeus was so disgusted by their behavior that he resolved to wash the world clean and start again. He would send a great flood. But there was one man and one woman who remained pious and just: Deucalion, the son of the tortured Prometheus and his wife, Pyrrha. Prometheus, seeing the coming doom from his rocky peak, managed to warn his son. He instructed him to build a great wooden chest, or ark, and to provision it for a long journey. Deucalion and Pyrrha did as they were told. Just as they sealed themselves inside, Zeus unleashed the deluge. The rains fell for 9 days and 9 nights, until the entire world was submerged. All of humanity was drowned in the floodwaters. Only the ark, carrying the last 2 good mortals, bobbed on the surface of the endless ocean. When the rains finally stopped, their ark came to rest on the peak of Mount Parnassus. Deucalion and Pyrrha emerged to a silent, empty, and desolate world. Overwhelmed by loneliness, they prayed to the goddess Themis for guidance on how to restore the human race. The goddess's voice came to them in an oracle, with a cryptic command: "Veil your heads and toss the bones of your mother over your shoulders as you walk." They were horrified. Desecrate their mother's grave? But the clever Deucalion solved the riddle. Their great mother was not their human mother, but Gaia, the earth, and her bones were the stones that littered the ground. And so they veiled their heads and began to walk, casting stones behind them. The stones that Deucalion threw transformed into men. The stones that Pyrrha threw transformed into women. A new race of mortals was born. But these were not the carefree people of the first age. They were born of stone, a harder, more resilient, and more enduring race, destined for a life of toil, but capable of rebuilding the world. The age of heroes was about to begin. The great flood had receded, leaving behind a new stone-born race of humanity. They were tough and resilient, built for the hardship of a world now filled with suffering and toil. But they were not alone. In this new age, the Olympian gods, now firmly in control of the cosmos, began to interact with the mortal world more directly and more intimately than ever before. They descended from their golden halls, sometimes in disguise, sometimes in their full divine glory, driven by lust, compassion, jealousy, or simple whim. From the unions of these gods and mortals, a new generation of beings was born. They were not quite gods, but they were far more than human. They were the demigods, the heroes, beings of extraordinary strength, courage, and beauty, whose lives burned brighter, faster, and often more tragically than any other. Their stories are the bedrock of Western adventure. This was the Age of Heroes, a time of legendary monsters, impossible quests, and earth-shattering destinies. The first great heroic saga serves as a blueprint for all others to come. It is a story of a cursed king, a divine birth, a seemingly impossible quest, and the inexorable power of fate. It is the tale of Perseus. It begins with a prophecy. King Acrisius of Argos was told by the oracle at Delphi that he would one day be killed by his own grandson. Terrified, Acrisius locked his only daughter, the beautiful Danae, in a bronze chamber, open to the sky but sealed from all mortal men. But no prison can keep out the king of the gods. Zeus, desiring Danae, transformed himself into a shower of pure gold, raining down through the skylight and into her lap. From this shimmering union, Perseus was born. When Acrisius discovered the child, he refused to believe in the divine birth. Still fearing the prophecy, but unwilling to directly murder his own kin and invoke the wrath of the Furies, he cast Danae and the infant Perseus into the sea, locked in a large wooden chest. But they were protected by Zeus and washed ashore on the island of Seriphos, where they were found by a kind fisherman named Dictys. Years passed. Perseus grew into a strong young man. But the king of the island, Polydex, desired Danae for himself and saw the protective Perseus as an obstacle. To get rid of him, the king hatched a cruel plot. He pretended he was to be married and demanded every citizen provide a horse as a wedding gift. Perseus, being a poor fisherman's ward, had no horse. In a moment of youthful pride and shame, he rashly promised the king any gift he desired. Polydex seized his chance and named the price, the head of the Gorgon, Medusa. It was a death sentence. Medusa was one of 3 monstrous sisters, the Gorgons. But while her sisters were immortal, Medusa was not. She was a creature so hideous that any mortal who gazed directly upon her face was instantly turned to stone. Her hair was a mass of writhing, venomous snakes. The quest was impossible. But Perseus was the son of Zeus, and the gods would not let him fail. The goddess Athena, who held a special grudge against Medusa, and the messenger god Hermes came to his aid. They guided him on a preliminary quest to find the 3 ancient, hag-like sisters who shared a single eye and a single tooth between them. By snatching their eye, as they passed it to one another, Perseus forced them to reveal the location of the nymphs of the north. These nymphs provided him with the divine tools he would need for his true quest. A pair of winged sandals to fly through the air, a magical bag, the kibises, which could safely contain the Gorgon's head, and most importantly, the helm of darkness from Hades, which would render him invisible. Athena gave him her highly polished bronze shield, and Hermes lent him an unbreakable adamantine sickle, the same type of weapon Cronus had once used against Uranus. Now armed, Perseus flew to the edge of the world. Guided by Athena, he entered the Gorgon's lair. All around him were the stony figures of men and beasts who had failed before him, frozen in their last moment of terror. He did not look at the Gorgons directly. Using the reflection in his polished shield as a mirror, he approached the sleeping Medusa. With one swift stroke of the adamantine sickle, he beheaded her. From her severed neck sprang 2 beings fathered by Poseidon, the winged horse, Pegasus, and the warrior Chrysaor. Perseus quickly thrust the still writhing snake-haired head into his bag and, using the helm of darkness to become invisible, he escaped the wrath of Medusa's immortal sisters. His journey home was no less eventful. Flying over the coast of Ethiopia, he saw a beautiful maiden, Princess Andromeda, chained to a rock by the sea as a sacrifice to Cetus, a sea monster sent to punish her mother's vanity. Perseus, smitten, swooped down, slew the monster, and claimed Andromeda as his bride. Upon returning to Seriphos, he found his mother hiding from the brutish king Polydics. He strode into the king's court, where the king and his followers mocked him, refusing to believe he had succeeded. "I have the gift you requested," Perseus announced. He then averted his own eyes, reached into his bag, and pulled out the head of Medusa. The king and all his courtiers were instantly turned to stone. Years later, the prophecy that started it all came to pass. Competing in an athletic competition, Perseus threw a discus that was caught by a stray wind. It veered into the crowd and struck an old man in the head, killing him instantly. The man was his grandfather, Acrisius, who had fled his own kingdom years before, trying in vain to outrun his fate. Perseus' story is one of divine aid and heroic success. But not all heroes who flew on winged steeds were so fortunate. The tale of Bellerophon is a darker story, a classic tragedy of heroism undone by pride. Bellerophon was a noble hero from Corinth, who, after accidentally killing his brother, was exiled. After many trials, he was given another impossible task: to kill the monstrous Chimera. The Chimera was a terrifying, fire-breathing hybrid. It had the head and body of a lion, a second head of a goat sprouting from its back, and a venomous snake for a tail. Bellerophon knew he could not face this beast on foot. The seer Polyidus advised him to seek the aid of the winged horse Pegasus, who now roamed wild. Bellerophon found the horse drinking at a spring in it. With the help of a golden bridle given to him by Athena, he tamed the magnificent creature. Aloft on Pegasus, Bellerophon was unstoppable. He swooped down on the Chimera, avoiding its fiery breath, and killed it with his spear. He went on to have many other victories, becoming a celebrated hero. But his success went to his head. He grew arrogant. In a supreme act of hubris, burrow pride, he began to believe that he, a mere mortal, was worthy of a place among the gods. He mounted Pegasus and spurred him on, attempting to fly to the very peak of Mount Olympus. Zeus, watching from his throne, was enraged by this mortal's arrogance. He sent a single gadfly, which stung Pegasus. The winged horse, startled and in pain, reared up, throwing Bellerophon from his back. He plummeted back to earth. He survived the fall, but he was left lame, blind, and cursed. He spent the rest of his days wandering the earth alone, devouring his own soul, hated by the gods he had tried to join. His story became a chilling cautionary tale for all future generations. While the tales of Perseus and Bellerophon were of individual heroes, some sagas encompassed entire cities and generations, stained by curses that trickled down from parent to child. The most infamous of these was the tragic history of the city of Thebes. It began with its founder Cadmus, who slew a dragon sacred to Ares and sowed its teeth into the earth. From the teeth sprang a race of violent, fully armed warriors, the Spartoi, who immediately fought each other until only 5 remained to become the first nobles of the city. Thebes was thus founded on violence. A curse was placed on Cadmus and all his descendants. Generations later, this curse would reach its horrifying apex in the life of Oedipus. It was prophesied to King Laius of Thebes that his son would kill him and marry his own mother. To avert this, when his son Oedipus was born, Laius had his ankles pierced and pinned, and ordered him left on a mountainside to die. But a shepherd took pity on the baby and gave him to the childless king and queen of Corinth, who raised him as their own. Years later, Oedipus, hearing a rumor that he was adopted, went to the oracle at Delphi. The oracle did not answer his question, but instead gave him the same terrible prophecy. He would kill his father and marry his mother. Believing the king and queen of Corinth were his parents, Oedipus fled, resolving never to return. On the road, at a place where 3 roads crossed, he got into a furious argument with an older nobleman in a chariot over who had the right of way. In a fit of rage, Oedipus killed the man and his entire retinue. The man, of course, was his true father, King Laius. The first part of the prophecy was fulfilled. Continuing on, Oedipus came to the city of Thebes, which was being terrorized by the Sphinx, a creature with the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the head of a woman. She blocked the road to the city and devoured anyone who could not answer her riddle. What goes on 4 feet in the morning, 2 feet at noon, and 3 feet in the evening? Oedipus brilliantly solved it. Man, who crawls on all 4s as a baby, walks on 2 feet as an adult, and uses a cane in old age. Defeated, the Sphinx threw herself from her rock and died. Hailed as a savior, Oedipus was made the new king of Thebes, and was given the hand of the widowed queen, Jocasta, his own mother. The prophecy was now complete, though no one knew it. Years of peaceful rule followed, but then a terrible plague struck Thebes. The oracle declared that the plague would not end until the murderer of the former king Laius was found and exiled. Oedipus, the good king, launched a zealous investigation, vowing to find the killer. In a masterpiece of dramatic irony, the detective was hunting himself. Through a series of horrifying revelations from the blind prophet Tiresias and a surviving servant, the truth was finally revealed. When Jocasta realized she had married her own son, she hanged herself. Oedipus, in a fit of grief and self-loathing, took the golden brooch from her dress and stabbed out his own eyes, crying that they would never again see the wretchedness he had created. He was then exiled, a blind wanderer. The curse of the house of Cadmus lived on, leading to a war between his sons that destroyed a generation. Not all sagas were so grim. Some were filled with the spirit of high adventure. The quest for the Golden Fleece is the first great ensemble story, a superhero team-up of the ancient world. The story begins in Iolcus, where King Peleus had usurped the throne from his half-brother. An oracle warned Peleus to beware the man with one sandal. Years later, a handsome young man named Jason arrived in the city, having lost a sandal while helping an old woman cross a river. The old woman was the goddess Hera in disguise, who now became Jason's divine protector. Peleus, recognizing the man from the prophecy, agreed to relinquish the throne, but only if Jason could complete an impossible quest: sail to the faraway land of Colchis at the edge of the Black Sea and bring back the legendary Golden Fleece. The fleece was guarded by a never-sleeping dragon. Jason accepted the challenge. He commissioned a magnificent ship, the Argo, and put out a call for the greatest heroes of the age to join his crew, the Argonauts. The roster was staggering. Heracles, the strongest man in the world. The heavenly twins, Castor and Pollux. Orpheus, a master musician whose songs could charm rocks and trees. And many more. Their journey was fraught with peril. They battled harpies, monstrous bird women who tormented a blind king. They navigated the Symplegades, the clashing rocks that crushed any ship sailing between them, by first sending a dove through to time their passage. When they finally reached Colchis, King Ates agreed to give Jason the fleece, but only if he could perform a series of impossible tasks, including yoking 2 fire-breathing bulls and sowing a field with dragon's teeth. The king's daughter, the powerful sorceress Medea, fell madly in love with Jason. Aided by Hera and Aphrodite, her passion was so great that she chose to betray her own family to help him. She gave him a magical ointment to protect him from the bull's fire and advised him on how to defeat the warriors that sprang from the dragon's teeth. She then used her magic to lull the dragon to sleep, allowing Jason to snatch the golden fleece. To escape her pursuing father, Medea committed a horrific act, killing her own younger brother and scattering his dismembered body parts into the sea, forcing her father's fleet to stop and gather them for burial. Jason returned to Greece a hero, the fleece in hand. But his story, too, ends in tragedy. After Medea used her magic to engineer the death of the usurper Peleus, she and Jason were exiled. Years later, Jason, the adventurer, grew tired of his foreign, sorceress wife. He broke his sacred oath to her and abandoned her to marry a Greek princess. Medea's love turned to a terrifying, all-consuming rage. In a chilling act of revenge, she murdered Jason's new bride with a poisoned dress, and to inflict the ultimate pain, she killed the 2 sons she had borne to Jason before flying away on a chariot drawn by dragons. Jason was left with nothing. He died years later, a lonely, broken man, when a rotten piece of his own glorious ship, the Argo, fell and crushed him. Of all the heroes, one name stands above all others. A man of impossible strength and equally immense suffering. The son of Zeus, who through his labors would earn a place on Olympus itself. This was Heracles. His story begins with Hera's jealousy. As the illegitimate son of her husband Zeus, she hated Heracles from the moment of his birth, sending 2 venomous snakes to his crib, which the infant hero simply strangled. Hera's persecution would follow him his entire life. As a young man, she sent a fit of madness upon him, during which he killed his beloved wife, Megara, and their children. When the madness passed and he realized what he had done, he was consumed by grief. Seeking purification, he went to the oracle at Delphi, who sentenced him to serve his cousin, King Eurystheus, and perform whatever 10 labors the king demanded. The cowardly Eurystheus, egged on by Hera, devised 12 seemingly impossible tasks. These 12 labors are a journey through the mythological world. He fought monsters, like the invincible Nemean lion, whose hide he wore ever after, and the 9-headed Lernaean hydra, which grew 2 new heads for every one that was cut off. He performed monumental feats, like cleaning the filth of the Augean stables in a single day by diverting 2 rivers. He traveled to the ends of the earth to steal the golden apples of the Hesperides, even briefly taking the sky from the Titan Atlas to do so. And for his final labor, he descended into the underworld itself and brought back the 3-headed guard dog, Cerberus, a feat no mortal had ever accomplished. His labors complete, Heracles was free, but his adventures continued. He sailed with the Argonauts, sacked the city of Troy a generation before the famous war, and fought on the side of the gods in the great war against the giants. But his end, like so many heroes, was tragic. He was inadvertently poisoned by his own wife, Deianira, who had been tricked into giving him a shirt soaked in the venomous blood of a centaur, believing it was a love charm. The poison burned his skin and caused him unimaginable agony. Unable to die but unable to bear the pain, Heracles built his own funeral pyre. As the flames consumed his mortal body, His divine part, the spirit of Zeus within him, was carried up to Mount Olympus. There he was finally reconciled with Hera, granted true immortality, and welcomed as one of the gods. He alone, through his suffering and strength, had transcended the tragic hero's fate. While Heracles was the champion of all Greece, the city of Athens had its own great hero, Theseus. If Heracles was brute strength, Theseus was intelligence and civic duty. The son of King Aegeus of Athens, Theseus proved his heroic nature by clearing the dangerous coastal road to his home city of bandits and monsters. Upon his arrival, he discovered that Athens was forced to pay a horrifying tribute to King Minos of Crete. Every 9 years, 7 young men and 7 young maidens were sent to be devoured by the Minotaur, a monstrous creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull, who lived at the center of a vast, inescapable labyrinth. Theseus volunteered to go as one of the youths, vowing to kill the monster. In Crete, King Minos' daughter, Ariadne, fell in love with him and gave him the tools for his success: a sword and a ball of thread to unspool as he walked, so he could find his way back out of the labyrinth. Theseus found the Minotaur in the dark center of the maze and, after a ferocious battle, killed it, freeing Athens from its terrible tribute forever. He became the great king of Athens, credited with uniting its people and establishing a democracy. But his later life was marked by poor judgment and tragedy. He abandoned Ariadne on an island. He forgot to change his ship's black sails to white, a prearranged signal for his father that he was safe, causing the old king to throw himself into the sea. In grief, the sea that now bears his name, the Aegean. He was eventually exiled from his own city and died an ignominious death, pushed from a cliff by a rival king. Perseus, Bellerophon, Oedipus, Jason, Heracles, Theseus. Their names echo through eternity. They battled monsters, founded cities, and defied death. But their stories teach a consistent lesson. The line between hero and monster, between glory and hubris, is dangerously thin. Their lives, blessed and cursed by the gods, were a whirlwind of triumph and tragedy. This heroic age, filled with so much glory and so much sorrow, was setting the stage for one final, cataclysmic event that would be the culmination of all their stories. A war so epic it would mark the end of their era forever. The greatest heroes of the next generation were about to be called to the shores of a city in Asia Minor, a city named Troy. The age of heroes had filled the world with legends. Their stories were songs of triumph, tragedy, and monstrous encounters. But the actions of individuals, no matter how great, were but a prelude. The fates were weaving a grander, more terrible tapestry, one that would require every remaining hero, every king, and every god to take a side. This final act of the heroic age would not be a quest or a duel, but a war. A world war. A decade of bloodshed over a single woman and a broken oath, a conflict so vast it would become the definitive legend of the Western world. This is the story of the Trojan War, a tale of how the petty squabbles of gods and the passions of mortals ignited a fire that consumed the greatest generation of heroes the world would ever know. Like all great fires, this one began not with an inferno, but with a single mischievous spark. The spark was struck at a wedding, the grandest wedding the world had ever seen. The mortal hero Peleus was marrying the beautiful sea nymph Thetis. So momentous was the occasion that all the gods of Olympus were invited to celebrate. All, that is, except one. Eris, the goddess of discord, was deliberately left off the guest list, for obvious reasons. Enraged at the slight, Eris crafted a plan for revenge. She appeared at the feast, unseen, and rolled a solid gold apple across the floor among the guests. The apple was inscribed with a single perfect phrase, Tau Eta Iota, Galis Te, to the fairest. Immediately, chaos erupted as intended. 3 of the most powerful goddesses each claimed the prize for herself. Hera, the proud queen of the gods; Athena, the wise goddess of war and wisdom; and Aphrodite, the irresistible goddess of love. The argument grew so heated, it threatened to tear Olympus apart. They turned to Zeus to judge, but he was far too clever to be caught in such a trap. To choose one would be to earn the eternal enmity of the other two. He wisely deferred judgment, declaring that the matter must be settled by the most handsome mortal man in the world. That man was Paris, a prince of Troy. Paris was then living as a shepherd on Mount Ida, exiled from Troy because of a prophecy that he would one day be the city's ruin. It was there that Hermes escorted the 3 goddesses for his judgment. Each goddess, in turn, attempted to bribe him. Hera offered him power, dominion over all of Europe and Asia. Athena offered him wisdom and skill in battle, guaranteeing he would be victorious in every war. But Aphrodite offered him a far more potent prize. She promised him the love of the most beautiful mortal woman in the world. Paris, a young man ruled by passion rather than ambition or intellect, made his choice. He awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite, earning the everlasting love of the goddess of love, and the everlasting, burning hatred of the queen of the heavens and the goddess of war. This single choice sealed the fate of his city. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, queen of Sparta. She was a daughter of Zeus, hatched from an egg, with a beauty that drove men to madness. She was also already married to King Menelaus of Sparta. But a promise from a goddess is a powerful thing. Paris sailed to Sparta, where he was welcomed as a guest in Menelaus's court. When the king was called away on business, Paris, with Aphrodite's aid, either abducted or persuaded Helen to elope with him, taking a vast portion of the Spartan treasury with them. They sailed back to Troy. When Menelaus returned to find his wife and his treasure gone, his fury was absolute. This was not just a personal betrayal. It was a grievous violation of the sacred laws of hospitality, an insult that demanded retribution. He went to his brother, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, and the most powerful ruler in Greece. They resolved to gather an army, sail to Troy, and burn the city to the ground. And they had the means to do it. Years before, when Helen was of marrying age, so many kings and princes had vied for her hand that her mortal father Tyndareus feared a war would break out no matter whom he chose. On the advice of the cunning Odysseus, he made every suitor swear a sacred oath that they would all defend the chosen husband against anyone who wronged him or interfered with the marriage. Now, the time had come to call in that oath. Messengers were sent to every corner of Greece. The kings were bound by honor and by sacred vow. They had to answer the call. The greatest heroes of the age began to muster. Agamemnon was chosen as commander-in-chief. The wise old King Nestor, the mighty Ajax, the skilled archer Teucer, the brilliant Diomedes. Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, tried to dodge his duty by feigning madness, plowing his fields with salt. But the recruiter, Palamedes, cleverly placed Odysseus's infant son in front of the plow. Odysseus swerved, proving his sanity, and was forced to join the war. The final and most crucial hero was Achilles. His mother, Thetis, knowing he was fated to die if he went to Troy, had hidden him on an island, disguised as a girl. But Odysseus, the master of trickery, uncovered him by presenting a table of beautiful jewelry and a single fine sword. While the girls admired the trinkets, Achilles instinctively grabbed the sword, revealing his identity. Presented with the choice between a long, peaceful, forgotten life and a short, glorious one that would be remembered forever, Achilles chose glory. He would be the Achaeans, the Greeks' greatest weapon. 1,000 ships, 100,000 men, gathered at the port of Aulis. But the fleet could not sail. There was no wind. The goddess Artemis was enraged at Agamemnon for killing one of her sacred stags. The seer Calchas delivered the terrible prophecy. The winds would not return until Agamemnon sacrificed his own daughter, Iphigenia, to appease the goddess. In a moment of brutal political necessity, Agamemnon chose his ambition over his family. He lured his daughter to the camp under the pretense of marrying her to Achilles. At the altar, just as she was about to be sacrificed, some say Artemis took pity and whisked her away, replacing her with a deer. But the sacrifice, in spirit, was made. The winds turned. The massive fleet set sail for Troy. For 9 long years, the Achaean army besieged the city. The war became a bloody, grinding stalemate. The Greeks controlled the beaches, but the high walls of Troy, built by Apollo and Poseidon themselves, were impregnable. The real story, the one immortalized by the poet Homer in the Iliad, takes place in the 10th and final year of the war, and it begins with a plague and a feud. A plague sent by Apollo swept through the Greek camp. It was punishment for Agamemnon, capturing the daughter of one of Apollo's priests. When forced to return the girl, Agamemnon, to reassert his authority, seized Achilles' own war prize, a captive woman named Briseis. This was an unforgivable insult to Achilles' honor. Enraged, Achilles withdrew from the war, taking his elite soldiers, the Myrmidons, with him. He sat by his ships, refusing to fight, and prayed to his mother Thetis to ask Zeus to favor the Trojans, so that the Greeks would suffer and realize how much they needed him. With Achilles, the Greeks' greatest warrior, off the field, the tide of the war turned dramatically. The Trojans, led by their noble and brilliant prince Hector, launched a furious assault. Hector was the perfect hero of Troy, a devoted husband and father, a patriot defending his home, and a warrior equal to any Greek save Achilles. In a moment of profound humanity, Homer shows us Hector saying goodbye to his wife, Andromache, and his infant son Astyanax, who was frightened by the horsehair crest on his father's helmet. It is a heartbreaking reminder of what is at stake. The Trojans pushed the Greeks back to their ships, threatening to burn the entire fleet. The situation was desperate. Achilles' dearest friend and companion, Patroclus, begged him to return. Achilles, still stubborn in his pride, refused, but he allowed Patroclus to wear his divine armor and lead the Myrmidons into battle to save the ships. The sight of Achilles' armor terrified the Trojans, and Patroclus drove them back. But in his success, he pushed too far. He came face to face with Hector, who, with the help of Apollo, struck him down, killing him and stripping him of Achilles' armor. When news of Patroclus' death reached Achilles, his pride was washed away by a tidal wave of grief and rage. It was a terrifying, inhuman sorrow. He reconciled with Agamemnon, accepting gifts and the return of Briseis, but none of it mattered. There was only one thing left: vengeance. His mother Thetis procured for him a new set of armor, forged by the god Hephaestus himself, and Achilles returned to the war. He was no longer a man. He was a divine force of destruction. He slaughtered Trojans by the score, so many that the river Scamander choked on their corpses and rose up to fight him. Finally, he reached the walls of Troy and called for his target. The final duel, the climax of the Iliad, took place before the city gates. Hector, briefly seized by fear, ran from Achilles, who chased him 3 times around the city walls. But Athena tricked Hector into stopping and fighting. The duel was swift and brutal. Achilles, knowing the weak points of his old armor that Hector now wore, drove his spear through Hector's throat. With his dying breath, Hector begged for his body to be returned to his parents for a proper burial. Achilles, his humanity consumed by rage, refused. In a final, shocking act of desecration, he tied Hector's body to the back of his chariot and dragged it in the dust around the walls of Troy, in full view of his grieving family. For 12 days, Achilles abused the corpse, but the gods preserved it from decay. Finally, guided by Hermes, the elderly King Priam of Troy humbled himself, journeying alone at night into the heart of the enemy camp to beg the killer of his son for the body. In a profoundly moving scene, Priam kissed the hands of the man who had murdered his children. Achilles, seeing the old king and thinking of his own aging father, was finally moved to pity. Their shared grief as mortals, one who had lost a son, one who was fated to die far from home, created a moment of shared humanity. Achilles returned Hector's body, and the Iliad ends with the funeral of the great Trojan prince. But the war was far from over. New allies came to Troy's aid. Penthesilea, the fierce queen of the Amazons, and Memnon, the king of the Ethiopians, both mighty warriors, were both slain by Achilles. But Achilles' own fate was sealed. The prophecy of his short, glorious life was about to be fulfilled. Paris, the man who had started the war, a man not known for his courage, fired an arrow from the walls of Troy. The god Apollo, who favored the Trojans, guided the arrow to the one place Achilles was vulnerable: his heel, the one spot his mother had held when she dipped him in the river Styx. The greatest warrior the world had ever known fell, killed by a coward's arrow. Even with Achilles and Hector gone, the city remained impregnable. Victory would require not strength, but cunning. It fell to Odysseus, the master strategist, to devise the war's final, most famous stratagem. He ordered the construction of a colossal wooden horse, hollow on the inside. He and a handful of the best Greek warriors hid within its belly. The rest of the Greek army burned their camps, boarded their ships, and pretended to sail for home, hiding just out of sight behind a nearby island. A single Greek soldier, Sinon, was left behind to be captured by the Trojans and sell them a story that the horse was a sacred offering to Athena, made so large that the Trojans could not bring it into their city, for if they did, their city would be invincible. The Trojans, desperate for the war to be over, were ecstatic. The priest Laocoon warned them, famously declaring, "I fear the Greeks, even when they bear gifts." But at that moment, 2 giant sea serpents rose from the ocean and devoured Laocoon and his sons. The Trojans took this as a sign that Laocoon had offended the gods. They ignored his warning, tore down a section of their own unbreakable walls, and dragged the Trojan horse into the city. That night, Troy celebrated its victory. They feasted and drank until the entire city was lost in a drunken sleep. In the dead of night, Sinon released the latch. Odysseus and his men crept out, slaughtered the guards, and opened the city gates. The Greek fleet, having sailed back under the cover of darkness, was waiting. The sack of Troy was a night of unrestrained, brutal horror. The victorious Greeks, drunk on wine and 10 years of frustrated rage, showed no mercy. They slaughtered men in their beds, threw babies from the ramparts, and desecrated the temples of the gods. The aged King Priam was butchered at a holy altar. These acts of profound sacrilege would not be forgotten by the gods. The victors had sealed their own doom. By dawn, the magnificent city of Troy was a smoking ruin. Its men were dead, its women and children taken as slaves. The war was over. The Greeks had won. But as the survivors stood on the shores of the ruined city, gazing at the embers of what was once the greatest power in the East, they stood not as triumphant conquerors, but as butchers who had lost their humanity. Their own journeys home would be fraught with storm, shipwreck, and betrayal, cursed by the very gods who had once fought on their side. The suffering was far from over. Victory. After 10 years of brutal warfare, the Achaean army had achieved its goal. The city of Troy was annihilated. Its treasures were plundered, its men were slain, and its women were enslaved. But as the Greek heroes stood on the blood-soaked shores of Asia Minor, the ashes of the once mighty city swirling around them, there was no triumphant celebration. There was only a cold, grim satisfaction, tainted by the profound, savage cruelty of their final victory. They had not just conquered a city, they had offended the heavens. The war did not truly end at the gates of Troy. It followed them home, onto the wine dark sea, into their palaces, and into their very beds. For the Greeks, victory was not the end of suffering, but the beginning of a new and more personal kind of hell. This is the story of the Nostoi the Returns. The gods on Olympus, who had once been divided in their loyalties, were now united in their fury. During the sack of Troy, the Greeks had committed unforgivable acts of sacrilege. In the temple of Athena, the warrior Ajax the Lesser had assaulted the Trojan princess Cassandra as she clung to a statue of the goddess. In the palace, the son of Achilles, Neoptolemus, had butchered the elderly King Priam at a holy altar. The gods' holiest laws had been trampled in a frenzy of bloodlust. Athena, once the staunchest ally of the Greeks, turned against them. She went to Poseidon, the god of the sea, and together they plotted a terrible retribution. The heroes who had taken 10 years to reach Troy would find the journey home even more arduous, and for many, fatal. The fate of Ajax the Lesser was swift and telling. As his ship was battered by a storm sent by Athena, he boasted that he would survive even in defiance of the gods. He managed to cling to a rock as his ship went down, and in his hubris, he cried out that the sea could not conquer him. Hearing this, Poseidon struck the rock with his trident, splitting it in two and sending the arrogant Ajax plunging to his death. His return ended at the bottom of the sea. But for the leader of the entire expedition, King Agamemnon, the gods reserved a far more intimate and horrifying fate. His journey home was swift and successful. He returned to his palace in Mycenae, a triumphant king, laden with the spoils of war, including the Trojan princess Cassandra as his concubine. But while he was away, fighting for a decade over another man's wife, his own home had rotted from within. His wife, Queen Clytemnestra, had never forgiven him for the sacrifice of their daughter, Iphigenia, at Aulis. Her grief had curdled into a cold, murderous hatred. She had taken a new lover, Aegisthus, Agamemnon's own cousin and a bitter enemy of his family. For 10 years they had been ruling Mycenae and plotting the king's demise. Agamemnon arrived, arrogant and blind to the danger. Clytemnestra greeted him with false praise, rolling out a lavish crimson tapestry for him to walk on in honor reserved for the gods. The prophetess Cassandra, cursed by Apollo to always see the future but never be believed, had a horrifying vision of the palace dripping with blood. She screamed of the curse on the house, of a slaughterhouse, a net of death. But no one listened. Agamemnon, basking in his victory, entered his palace and went to take a bath. It was there that his wife, Clytemnestra, trapped him. As he emerged from the water, she threw a heavy net-like robe over him, tangling his arms. And while he was helpless, she struck him down with an axe, like a sacrificial bull. His return home lasted only a few hours. The great conqueror of Troy was murdered in his own bathtub by his wife. This cycle of violence would continue until his son Orestes returned years later to avenge him by murdering both Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, an act that would see him pursued by the terrifying Furies all across Greece. The war had poisoned everything it touched. Of all the cursed returns, one stands alone in its epic scope, a 10-year odyssey of one man's struggle against monsters, magic, and the wrath of an angry god. It is the story of Odysseus, the brilliant strategist who won the war with the Trojan horse, a man who now only wanted to return to his small, rocky island kingdom of Ithaca, to his loyal wife, Penelope, and his son, Telemachus. But Odysseus had made a powerful enemy, Poseidon, god of the sea, and the sea would be his battleground. His journey began with his fleet of 12 ships. After a series of early misadventures, they landed on the island of the Cyclopes, a race of brutish, one-eyed giants. Driven by a fatal curiosity, Odysseus and 12 of his men entered the cave of the largest of the Cyclopes, Polyphemus, a son of Poseidon. The giant returned, rolled a massive boulder across the entrance, and began to devour Odysseus's men, 2 at a time. Trapped and facing certain death, Odysseus's cunning mind went to work. He offered the Cyclops a skin of powerful, unwatered wine. The giant, having never tasted it before, drank greedily and fell into a drunken stupor. He asked Odysseus his name. "My name," said the clever hero, "is Autus." Nobody. Once the giant was asleep, Odysseus and his men took the giant's olive wood club, sharpened its point, and hardened it in the fire. They then drove the flaming stake into the Cyclops' single eye, blinding him. Polyphemus awoke with a roar of agony, and the other Cyclopes on the island came running. "What's wrong?" They shouted from outside the cave. "Who is hurting you?" "Nobody is hurting me," Polyphemus cried. "Nobody is killing me." His brothers, thinking him mad or cursed, simply went away. The next morning, the blind giant rolled back the stone to let his sheep out to graze, feeling their backs to make sure no men were riding them. But Odysseus and his men had clung to the bellies of the giant rams, and so they escaped unseen. They scrambled back to their ship and set sail. But here, Odysseus made a devastating mistake. In a moment of pure, triumphant pride, he could not resist taunting his defeated foe. He shouted back to the shore, revealing his true name. "If anyone asks who blinded you, tell them it was Odysseus, son of Laertes, from Ithaca." Polyphemus now had a name to curse. He prayed to his father, Poseidon, to avenge him, begging that Odysseus either never return home, or if he must, that he return late, alone, in a stranger's ship, and to a home full of trouble. Poseidon heard his son's prayer. The next 10 years of Odysseus's life would be the fulfillment of that curse. His journey became a tour of the mythical world. He encountered the sorceress Circe, who turned his men into pigs, a fate he only avoided with the help of a magical herb given to him by Hermes. He stayed with her for a year, a prisoner of her sensual charms, before she directed him on his next, most terrifying task. He had to sail to the edge of the world and journey into the land of the dead. In the underworld, he spoke with the shades of the fallen. He saw his own mother, who had died of grief for him. He saw Agamemnon, who warned him of betrayal at home. He saw Achilles, who told him he would rather be a slave on earth than a king among the dead. And he received his prophecy from the blind seer Tiresias, who warned him of the trials to come. He returned to the world of the living, a man haunted by what he had seen. He navigated the deadly sirens, whose beautiful song lured sailors to their deaths, by having his men plug their ears with wax, while he had himself tied to the ship's mast, so he alone could hear their song and live. He made the impossible choice to sail past Scylla, a 6-headed monster who snatched 6 of his men from the deck, rather than risk his entire ship in the whirlpool of Charybdis. His journey reached its final breaking point on the island of the sun god Helios. Tiresias had explicitly warned him not to harm the sacred cattle that grazed there. But while Odysseus slept, his starving, mutinous crew slaughtered and ate some of the cows. When Helios discovered this, his rage was absolute. He demanded vengeance from Zeus, who struck Odysseus's last ship with a thunderbolt, killing every remaining man. Only Odysseus survived, clinging to a piece of wreckage. He drifted for days until he washed ashore on the island of Ogygia, home to the beautiful nymph Calypso. She fell in love with him and held him there, a prisoner in paradise, for 7 long years. He had lost his crew, his ships, his hope. Every day he would sit on the shore, staring out at the empty sea and weeping for the home he thought he would never see again. Finally, after 20 years away from home 10 at Troy, and 10 lost at sea, the goddess Athena intervened, persuading Zeus to order Calypso to release him. He built a small raft and set sail, only to be shipwrecked one last time by a furious Poseidon. He washed up, naked and broken, on the shore of Phaeacia. It was there, after telling his incredible story to the king, that he was finally granted passage home. He fell asleep and woke up on the shores of Ithaca. But his home was not as he had left it. It was overrun with over 100 arrogant suitors, all vying to marry his wife Penelope, believing him to be dead. They were devouring his wealth, harassing his servants, and plotting to kill his son, Telemachus. Disguised as a beggar, Odysseus infiltrated his own palace, testing the loyalty of his servants and assessing the strength of his enemies. He was mocked, abused, and kicked by the suitors. He revealed himself to his now grown son, and together they plotted their revenge. Penelope, who had cleverly held off the suitors for years, by claiming she had to first weave a funeral shroud for her father-in-law, a task she secretly unwove every night, finally declared she would marry the man who could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads. One by one, the suitors tried and failed. They couldn't even bend the mighty bow. Then the old beggar asked for a turn. The suitors laughed, but Telemachus insisted. Odysseus took the bow, and with effortless ease he strung it. He plucked the string, which sang like a swallow. He then knocked an arrow and shot it cleanly through all 12 axes. In a flash, he threw off his rags. "Your contest is over," he declared. "Now my own contest begins." He shot the lead suitor through the throat. Pandemonium erupted. Telemachus and 2 loyal servants, who had hidden the suitor's weapons, joined him. What followed was a bloody, brutal slaughter. Odysseus, the great warrior, unleashed 20 years of rage upon the men who had defiled his home. When it was over, the great hall was slick with the blood of 108 dead suitors. He had reclaimed his kingdom. His reunion with the clever and cautious Penelope, who tested him one last time to be sure it was truly him, was the final, hard-won prize of his epic journey. While the victorious Greeks struggled to return to their homes, a different story was unfolding for the defeated Trojans. Not all of them perished in the flames. Aeneas, a prince of Troy and son of the goddess Aphrodite, was commanded by the gods to escape. In a powerful scene of Roman piety, he fled the burning city, carrying his elderly father Anchises on his shoulders, holding his young son, Ascanius, by the hand, and leading a small band of survivors. Their journey was not a return, but a quest for a new home. Like Odysseus, Aeneas wandered the Mediterranean for years. He journeyed to the underworld, where his father's spirit showed him a vision of the future glory of the race he was destined to found. His journey finally led him to the shores of Italy. His destiny, as foretold in Virgil's great epic, the Aeneid, was not to reclaim a lost kingdom, but to establish a new one. After many wars with the local Latin tribes, Aeneas and his Trojan survivors established themselves. From his bloodline, generations later, would come the twin brothers Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of the city of Rome. And so, from the ashes of Troy, the seeds of the Roman Empire were planted. The Greek heroic age ended in fire, but its legacy would be reborn, transformed, and carried forward by a new great power, ensuring that the stories of Olympus and the Trojan War would never be forgotten. The age of heroes was over. The great figures were either dead, home, or had forged new destinies. The world of myth, with its constant, direct divine intervention, began to recede. The gods grew more distant. The age of men, with their own laws, cities, and empires, was about to begin. The songs had all been sung, but their echoes would shape the world for millennia to come. The ashes of Troy have long gone cold. Odysseus, the last great wanderer, is home in Ithaca. The sons of Agamemnon have enacted their grim vengeance, and a fragile peace has settled over the shores of the Aegean. The giants of the heroic age, the demigod children of lustful gods and formidable mortals, have all played their part. They have loved, fought, conquered, and died. Their stories are now the songs of bards, the tales told by a fireside, the whispers of a bygone era. But what happens after the story ends? What does the world look like when the gods fall silent, when monsters no longer lurk in the dark corners of the map, and when men are left, for the first time, truly to themselves? This is the final chapter of our mythological history, the story of an ending, a great fading, and the slow, uncertain transition from the age of heroes into the age of men. The generation that fought at Troy was the last of its kind. Their children and grandchildren, while often embroiled in their own dramatic tales, operated on a different scale. Their struggles were not against hydras and gorgons, but against the more human monsters of political intrigue, inheritance disputes, and the blood feuds born from their parents' sins. The world was shrinking from a mythic canvas to a human stage. Perhaps the most telling of these after-stories is that of Orestes, the son of the murdered Agamemnon. To avenge his father, he was commanded by Apollo to commit the one crime the gods would not forgive: matricide. He returned to Mycenae and killed his mother Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. Immediately, the Furies, the ancient Phoenician goddesses of blood vengeance born from the castration of Ouranos, rose from the earth to pursue him. They were the embodiment of the old world's justice. An eye for an eye, a blood debt that could never be paid. Orestes was hounded across the Greek world, driven to the edge of madness. But his story does not end with a hero's tragic death or a god's direct intervention. It ends in a courtroom. In Athens, the goddess Athena herself convenes the first ever murder trial on the hill of the Areopagus. The Furies act as the prosecution, Apollo as the defense, and a jury of 12 Athenian citizens listens to the arguments. The vote of the jury is a tie, 6 for acquittal, 6 for condemnation. It is Athena who casts the deciding vote, a vote for mercy. She argues that the cycle of blood for blood must end, replaced by a system of civic justice, of reason and law. She placates the Furies, transforming them from terrifying agents of vengeance into the humanities, the kindly ones, honored protectors of the city. This story is a profound allegory for the change sweeping the world. The old, primal, chaotic justice of the Furies gives way to the new, rational, human justice of the courtroom. The gods are still present, but their role has changed. They are no longer the direct enforcers, but the divine patrons of a human system. The age of vendetta is ending, and the age of the polis, the city-state, is beginning. As the descendants of the heroes dealt with their human-scale dramas, a great silence began to fall from Mount Olympus. The frequent, chaotic, and often violent interventions of the gods began to cease. Zeus's affairs became less numerous, or at least less chronicled. Poseidon no longer smashed ships with the same personal fury. The gods seemed to be ... retreating. Why? Perhaps the Trojan War had served as a grim lesson. They had watched the world's greatest heroes, many of them their own children, slaughter each other for 10 years over a quarrel that had begun at a wedding. Perhaps they saw in humanity's growing capacity for organized warfare and civilization a power that was beginning to rival their own, a world that no longer required their constant, meddling presence. The relationship between mortals and the divine began to formalize. Encounters with gods were no longer a matter of meeting a stranger at a crossroads who turned out to be Hermes in disguise. Worship became institutionalized. Great stone temples were built, like the Parthenon in Athens or the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. Priesthoods were established. Complex rituals were codified, and grand, state-sponsored festivals became the primary mode of communication with the heavens. Events like the Olympic Games, held in Zeus's honor, or the Panathenaic Festival for Athena, channeled the competitive and passionate energy of the Greeks into ritualized, civic celebrations rather than heroic, world-altering quests. The gods were being placed on pedestals, both literally and figuratively. They were moving from being active family members to distant, powerful ancestors. The world was becoming less magical, but more predictable. The great, terrifying mysteries were being replaced by the manageable complexities of religion and politics. As the age of myth receded, the Greeks needed a way to connect their own, present-day reality to the glorious, half-forgotten time of heroes. They needed a bridge between myth and history. They found it in a collection of legends that explained the very configuration of their own world, the world of classical Greece. The most important of these transitional myths was the return of the Heraclidae, the return of the descendants of Heracles. The story goes that after Heracles' death, his many children were exiled from their homes in the Peloponnese by his rival Eurystheus. For generations, they wandered as exiles. Finally, several generations after the Trojan War, the great-great-grandsons of Heracles gathered an army and launched a final massive invasion of the Peloponnese to reclaim the lands they believed were their birthright. This invasion was a success. They conquered the great Mycenaean strongholds of Agamemnon and Menelaus, and divided the land among themselves, establishing new kingdoms. The Heraclidae became the founders of the Dorian Greek states, most notably the powerful and militaristic city of Sparta. For the ancient Greeks, this was not just a myth. It was history. It was their explanation for a real-world event that historians now call the Dorian invasion, a period around 1200 BCE that saw the collapse of the Bronze Age Mycenaean civilization and the beginning of the Greek Dark Ages, out of which the new city-states of Sparta, Corinth, and Argos would emerge. Myth had now become a political charter. The twin kings of Sparta claimed to be directly descended from Heracles to legitimize their rule. The people of Athens looked to the tale of Theseus, their founding hero, who they claimed established their democracy, to define their civic identity in opposition to the Dorian invaders. The stories were no longer just tales of adventure. They were the foundational documents of a civilization, the divine justification for political power and cultural identity. The line between myth and history had not just blurred. It had been deliberately erased. As Greek civilization matured, its relationship with its own foundational myths grew more complex. The rise of philosophy in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE brought a new tool to bear on these ancient stories: critical reason. Thinkers like Xenophanes of Colophon looked at the gods of Homer and Hesiod, who were portrayed as lying, stealing, cheating, and committing adultery, and launched a powerful critique. He famously wrote that if oxen and horses had hands and could draw, they would draw their gods to look like oxen and horses. He argued that mortals had simply created gods in their own flawed image, and that there must be one, single, non-anthropomorphic god, unlike mortals in either body or mind. Later, Plato, in his Republic, took this critique even further. He saw the traditional myths as dangerous lies, stories that portrayed the divine as immoral and capricious. He argued that these tales were unsuitable for the education of the citizens of his ideal state, and that the poets who told them should be censored or banned. Other thinkers took a different approach, seeking not to discard the myths, but to reinterpret them. The Stoics, for example, argued that the stories were allegories for natural phenomena. Zeus was not a literal god on a throne, but an allegory for the sky or the rational principle of the cosmos, the logos. The violent castration of Ouranos was not a literal act, but a metaphor for the separation of the elements. They were attempting to reconcile their ancient stories with their new, more scientific worldview. In just a few centuries, the Greek mind had traveled from accepting these stories as divine truth to using them as political history, to analyzing them as corrupting falsehoods, to finally reinterpreting them as complex allegories. The myths were so deeply embedded in the culture that each new intellectual movement had to grapple with them, to either debunk, tame, or transform them. And so our chronological journey comes to an end. From the formless void of chaos to the establishment of the Roman Empire, we have traced the grand, violent, and beautiful arc of Greek mythology. We have witnessed the birth of the universe, the brutal wars of the gods, the dazzling and tragic lives of the heroes, the clash of civilizations at Troy, and the long, painful journeys home. We have seen how these stories served their creators, as a religion to explain the unexplainable, as a history to ground their identity, as a political tool to legitimize power, and as a boundless source of art and literature. But why do we, thousands of years later, still return to them? Why do the names of Achilles, Oedipus, and Antigone still resonate with such power? It is because these stories, in their raw and unfiltered state, are about us. They are a grand, sprawling exploration of the human condition. They hold up a mirror to our own world, reflecting our noblest aspirations and our most terrifying flaws. In the hubris of Bellerophon, we see the danger of our own ambition. In the suffering and ultimate redemption of Heracles, we see the possibility of enduring the unbearable. In the tragic fate of Oedipus, we confront the terrifying limits of human knowledge and control. In the cunning of Odysseus, we celebrate our ingenuity and resilience. And in the rage of Achilles, we see the destructive power of our own grief and pride. These myths are the foundational DNA of Western culture. They are the source code for our concepts of heroism, tragedy, justice, and fate. They are not just stories about what the ancient Greeks believed. They are stories about what it means to be human, in any age. The gods may have retreated from the world, but they have never truly left us. They live on, immortal, in the stories we continue to tell.